We have next Ted Bowman. Ted Bowman is an educator, author, and consultant who specializes in change and transition, whether it occurs in families, an organization, or the community. His emphasis on aiding people in utilizing their strengths and the resources of others in facing change and transition. He's a frequent trainer, consultant, and speaker with many groups throughout Minnesota, across the United States, and other countries. He has published more than 100 articles, chapters, booklets, and poems. Ted has come as highly recommended to our conference. I think you'll find his message inspiring, useful, in the context of living with dementia or caring for someone living with dementia. So, Mr. Bowman, please. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. I've been looking forward to meeting you and being with you for an hour and a half this afternoon. This wonderful June 1st day. It's an honor and privilege to be here. So you see there in the slides my email and website. I always put those because I've gone to more workshops than all of you put together and realize that most of the best questions usually happen about 2 hours after the session's over or 2 days later. So feel free to continue the conversation even after we finish with this particular session, that we can move forward. So take a pause. Not only after lunch, not too long a pause, because some of you maybe usually take a nap after lunch, especially on Saturday. I urge you not to do that today. But to stay with me. But take a pause. Louise Erdrich, the local indigenous woman and wonderful poet, in one of her poems says, sometimes you just have to take your own hand. So can I ask those in the room and those of you who are with us virtually simply to take your own hand as we pause, as we talk about tough stuff, as we talk about changes and ones that we love, even in our own bodies and the person that we love. And let me ask those of you who are in the room, those of you who are virtual, I'll let you be creative with this. But Bob Benninga some years ago said that those who get through a tragedy, those who get through a rough patch in their lives, those who deal with adversity well, point at least to one person who stood by them, supported them, and gave them a sense of hope. So can I ask the people here in the room, would you turn to the people at your tables and say thank you for being here? And with those of you at home, will you shout it out to the universe? Thank you to those who are part of my team. We all do better when we all do better. So just to add to Joe's introduction, and thanks to him, to Robin, to Ashley, the team who've made the liaison with me go so well, a wonderful team to work with. But I want to let you know that one person's story of dementia is one person's story of dementia. And so while I know something of what you might be going through, I do not know your story. So let me first give you the voice of Howard Thurman. I share with you the agony of your grief. The anguish of your heart finds echo in my own. I know I cannot enter all that you feel, nor bear with you the burden of your days, your suffering, your adjustments. I can in this next hour offer but what my care does give, the strength of my caring, the warmth of one who seeks to understand as we each go through our seasons of loss and grief and hope. This I will do as I move through some slides and some stories that you might not be walking alone on your lonely path, but know that I'm trying to walk with you. I share that because I do know something about this quite personally. My mom died in 2009 at age 93, after 6 to 8, who knows how many years of moving through the fog of dementia. We began to lose our mother before we lost our mother. And so we know something of that story. I grew up in North Carolina, the middle of 3 sons, and so my brothers and I joined hands together to be caregivers for our parents in those last 8 to 9 years. As Mom was moving further into the fog, we were losing more and more of her. And Dad, as he put it, was living in a body that was falling apart. On the odd years, they took something out. On the even years, they put something in. They were quite a team. And so I come knowing a bit of what you might be going through, but it's my story, and you have your story. And so part of what my brothers and I experienced multiple times over those 8 to 9 years was what Joyce Hutchinson has written in this caregiver prayer. There are many days when the last thing I want to do is smile or have a good laugh. This caring for a dying one is tough. It takes its toll on the human spirit. Help me to find moments in the day when I can smile. Help my loved one and me to laugh together, to find the little joys in life that sustain and uplift us. Be with us. That's what I'm going to try to do with you this afternoon. So to do this, let's go back a few years. Here's some wisdom from the 13th century. I don't think there's anyone in the room quite that old. A marvelous Middle Eastern poet by the name of Rumi. And he had chose this metaphor. What a haunting metaphor. This being human is a guest house. This being human is a guest house. Then he announces every morning a new arrival. And then I love it that he has an arc of life, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Things happen in our lives. Think about March 6, 2020, the first confirmed case of COVID here in Minnesota. Think of what we were doing on March 4th and 5th, and then began to think about what we were doing on March 8th and 9th and 10th and 15th, and here we are even almost 4 years later. Our lives were turned upside down. Think about all of the ways in which our lives are changed by this guest house, that things happen in our lives. And it was countercultural in the 13th century, and regrettably still is in many cases, many places in our world today. The next line of the poem was countercultural. But listen to what he's saying. It's part of what I want to say to you this afternoon. Welcome and entertain them all. Welcome and entertain them all. Not welcome in the sense of spin or rose-colored glasses or look on the bright side or boy, you'll learn something from this or any of those things that we say regrettably to one another, but rather how do I even embrace the tragic, embrace the medical or mental health condition I wish that nobody would ever have. How do I begin to marshal my resources? How do I ask for help? How do I begin to go day by day and living with what has come? Here's an example of wisdom from a 6-year-old. Grandfather had died. The funeral had been held, and he came over to his granny's house a few days after the funeral and asked one of those questions that seemingly only 6 and 7 and 8-year-olds can ask. We need one of those in our lives. Granny, do you ever want to talk about Grandpa, or do you never want to talk about Grandpa? How's that for a question? I'm impressed that you are here with me and with one another in this room this afternoon, and at least 250 to 300 people of you are with us also virtually. Granny, do you ever want to talk about Grandpa, or do you never want to talk about Grandpa? Do you ever want to talk about what's going on, or do you never want to talk about it? Well, this grandmother was a wise one, knowing this was an early threshold for a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, perhaps even for a 30-year-old. Wanted to get it right because this was a threshold moment, and each of you have crossed over a threshold in these past months and years. And so she said cautiously, there are times when I need to talk about him very much. I need to talk about it very much because it helps me. I hope this workshop will help you in that way. But there are other times when I feel that I can't, either because it hurts too much or because it feels private at that particular moment. But on the whole, I want to talk. I hope you might be willing, I won't ask you to do it, but I hope you might be willing to say with me, but on the whole, I want to talk. We need to talk about these kinds of things. So this young boy sat and digested it in silence and then turned to his granny and asked another question. So it's hard to do what you feel like, right? Well, she was a bit reluctant to say a firm yes, but said a kind of tentative yes, and she did. And he said, well, I'm ready. Let's talk about him. We also need people like that in our lives, don't we? I love it when people come up to me who might have known something but not a lot about my wife's sudden death in 2020, July, just a few months after the COVID came along. But when they come up and say, would you introduce me to Marge? Would you tell me some of her story? That's a lot easier than those people who come up and say, Ted, how are you doing? Tell me the story. Are you willing to talk about this person, this life in some ways? So what I'm beginning to talk about is change is a time when predictability breaks down. Remember, this being human is a guest house, every morning a new arrival. And so when change arrives at our door, slowly over time, in some cases with the dementias, we begin to adjust to what mother will show up today. What are we dealing with today? What's the next loss that might come along? So our predictable ways in thinking and doing things are interrupted by changes, and we are faced with something that many people in America have a great deal of trouble with, and that's what we call uncertainty, ambiguity. We are a culture that strives for clarity, problem solving, wanting to fix it, rescue. Some of you may even be sitting in the chairs wherever you are this afternoon hoping that Ted will say something that might help fix it. I'm not going to help you fix it. I'm hoping that I can help you to live with it, to live as fully as you can and help your loved ones to live as fully as they can for as long as they can. I hope you know that's the hospice rule around the world. The hospice rule is not about dying. The hospice rule is to live as fully as you can for as long as you can. It's about living and living fully in whatever ways that we might as we begin to deal with uncertainty. Some of you are dealing with what we might call anticipatory uncertainty. I won't read this whole poem by Jane Kenyon, but it's a haunting poem called Otherwise. I got out of bed on 2 strong legs. It might have been otherwise. I ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe, flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. I took the dog uphill to the birch wood all morning. I did the work I love. A typical day. Think about your typical day some years ago, or your typical day even now, if there is such a thing for you as a typical day. And then look toward the end of the poem. I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the wall and planned another day just like this day. But one day I know it will be otherwise. But one day I know it will be otherwise. Even though I'm a grief and family educator, it took me too long with Mom. When I went to North Carolina to be with her, to live with her and Mom and Dad 24/7, to embrace, as the child was doing with Granny, be willing to talk about what was going on, see it live and in living color as they went to bed, as they got up in the morning, and so on. To come to grips with, to embrace whatever mother showed up. Because as I traveled to North Carolina as a long-distance caregiver, my brothers lived there so they could do the day-to-day kind of caregiving, but they did not want to live with Mom and Dad as I did when I went there for weeks at a time and so on. But to begin to embrace whatever mother showed up and to be quite willing to do that. It's what Pauline Boss and others talk about as ambiguous losses, that we don't know from one day to the other what things might be going on. And the result of that, for many of us, is we lose our assumed world. This is a phrase first used by one of my English colleagues, Colin Murray Parkes, great British grief scholar. He says, all of us from the moment of our birth, and this is again that typical day, have been building inside ourselves a model of the world, a set of assumptions on the basis of which we recognize the world, and we hope that the next day will be something like it. And then look at the part that's underlined there. anything which challenges this model can incapacitate us. When we begin to move from the typical, the expected, the wanted, to something that's unexpected and not wanted, it's the loss of the assumed world. Here's a story I was writing about Mom. The Alzheimer's came first. Later came a stroke. She had a left side stroke. The Alzheimer's came first. Later came the stroke, robbing her diamonds and pearls. She lost the past, and she lost her left side. The stories she loved, she lost, and her mobility. Still she smiled. "I love you." "Thank you, dear." "Oh, you're a handsome fellow." I thought she was only saying that when I arrived, but I understood that she said that to any man who entered a room. "So good. Your hands feel so warm." She loved us all, grandchildren, nurses, friends. A smile can soften the blow, especially a genuine love of people and of life, and she seemed to still embrace life. No doubt there was grief and loneliness and abject fear, but those she kept tucked away, not for public display, allowing her smile to fill the room. Mom, it makes your dying harder and easier. Our tears blend with smiles, grief and unexpected joy overflow. There's ambiguity. There's the loss of the assumed world. To begin to seize the moments, grab whatever we can. Every morning a new arrival, but also grieving the slow deterioration of our mother as she began to move further and further into the fog. So here are some accounts of losses of assumed worlds, the ambiguity. You may know Joan Didion's wonderful book, The Year of Magical Thinking. In this case, she and her husband came home in New York from their typical day, their assumed day, the routine and so on. They were having late afternoon, what you and I and others might have, some snacks, maybe a glass of wine or a beer or some tea, whatever it might be. She suddenly became aware that the other side of the room was quiet. And she began, not knowing it, she began writing the book, The Year of Magical Thinking. Life changes fast, life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner and life as you know it ends. Your and my losses are probably not going to be that rapid, have not been that rapid, but more slowly. Life changes slowly or rapidly. And then in the middle part, this is from Cornelius Eady. And in this case, his father is dying. And Cornelius is doing like lots of us, trying to do all that we can and say and bring to our world to help people to live as long as they can, that we don't want people to die too quickly. And this is the old man speaking. He will glare, or it's the perception of his son. He will glare at his son's persistence with the anger that the sick have for what a healthy body cannot know. The old man who's dying looks at his son and the projection that his son has. How he glares at me with this, at his son's persistence with the anger that the sick have for what a healthy body cannot know. He will force me to smell the blossom of his terrible resolve. He would rather die. How do we begin to access whatever is going on? I always thought that my mom knew more than she was able to say, but I wondered what was going on inside her. And so there I was trying to be as empathic as I could, just to sit with her, even in her silence. I wanted more. I yearned for more. I wanted to know what she knew, but I wouldn't know. And so I was recognizing that at times she would just say, by her face, "Would you just sit with me?" And my brothers and I began to believe and experience that if she was, especially toward the end, in a coma-like state, was not giving us any words, we weren't even sure if she was awake, and so on, we hoped that even if she awoke for one moment, opened her eyes, that she would see a loving son sitting there beside her. How do we seize the moments, deal with our grief as well as our love of people? Perhaps the third one here gets a bit closer to some of your stories. It's from the Summer of the Great Grandmother by Madeline Engel. You may know that classical book of Minnesota families. And this is the story of a daughter dealing with her mother with dementia. I know this is a classic symptom of dementia, this turning against the persons that you love most. This knowledge is secure above my eyebrows, but very shaky below. I want my mother to be my mother, and she's not anymore, not ever again. I just want my mother to be my mother, and she's not anymore, not ever again. It's what narrative therapist in Australia and New Zealand, Michael White, calls reauthoring lives. He says that, asserted that after disruptive changes, slowly or rapidly, many people experience, as they are grieving, the need to reauthor their lives, to reintroduce themselves to one another, to reintroduce myself to my mother, instead of pumping her with questions, as we often do. I'll come back to that a bit later, to just be willing to sit with her and to talk with her about whatever might be coming. She, for example, one day we were sitting there and she was doing something a bit atypical, not looking at me, but seemed to be looking over my shoulder. And I thought, what is going on? And I began to look behind me, and there on the wall behind was a calendar. And on the calendar was a dog. And I looked at the calendar and I looked at her, and she finally spoke and said, "He's looking at me. He's looking at me." And I said, "So am I. And I see a lovely woman. I'm glad that I can sit here with you. I hope the dog sees you the same way." I think what my mom was trying to say, but didn't have the words for it, was, I want you to see me. She would never be that assertive, never be that direct, but could do it by talking about the dog seeing her. That my two brothers and me would continue to see her and be with her no matter what might be happening. So I'm dealing with some tough stuff after lunch. I hope I'm not putting you to sleep, but rather reminding you that it's important that we talk about the tough things. So if you ask people to free associate on the words grief and loss, about 65% in most surveys will say something about death and dying early on. But look at this definition. Loss refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. I want my mother to be my mother. Losing conversation, finishing sentences. Remember Irma Bombeck? Be careful about him divorcing someone. You might meet them one day to finish a sentence. The same way, as my wife died, what do I miss most, especially early mornings when I get up, is morning conversation. What's the weather today? What should we do? Should we take a walk? Do you want cereal or do you want eggs? When you live a solo life as a widower, you're talking to yourself, and the same happens for some of you, depending on the state of the person that you love in terms of how they are responding to what's going on. And so these losses begin to disrupt not only the present story, but past stories. We wonder, what did we miss? Why didn't we see this earlier? And one of the big losses for lots of us is the loss of dreams and the loss of the future story. Wonder where this is going to go. And even if we don't know the answer to that, that we lose these roles, we lose conversation, we lose the prospect of travel. We even wonder about our loved one's safety, our own safety, and all of those losses. So it's these multiple losses that are important for us. And then our body's response. Loss comes first. We often say the words grief and loss as if grief is first. But loss is first, and then our body grieves it. And that can be confusing, especially in families, because we grieve differently. Some people will do it quite emotionally, the sadness, the tears, the rage, the anger. Some people will do it quite cognitively because they want more information. What should we do? How do we do this? Do we have enough insurance? Think about all the families that had to decide, could they have a funeral during the COVID? And so on. What do we do? How do we do that? And so on. It's a spiritual response to loss. What kind of world, what kind of meaning, how do we make sense of this, what kind of God, all of that. And then a big one for you and for me is a physical, a visceral response to loss. Why am I so tired? I'm just not thinking clearly these days. I just don't want to make one more decision right now. I just need some energy to get through the next day. That's grieving. Your body's grieving. What did the Minnesota Health Department tell us shortly after March 6th? Not that long afterwards. Because of the ambiguity, because of the uncertainty, try to have some anchors of stability in your life. Try to have good sleep patterns. Try to have 3 good meals a day and do good body care. 3 anchors of stability in a time of instability, a time of uncertainty, and that's the same way with some of the dementias and the Alzheimer's and so on. I did a caregiver group for 14 years in my neighborhood, and there was a woman in the caregiver group for 3 or 4 years who knew that if she did not go swimming at least once a week, her man was not going to get good care. Anchors of stability. She just needed to get into the water, move that body through the water, nobody else talking to her, just doing some good body care. What's your way of taking care of yourself? What are some of your anchors of stability? How do you do it? So you probably can recite this one with me, the wisdom of Rosalind Carter. There are only 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who need a caregiver. And part of what I want to assert, but knowing that we have both professionals and family members and volunteers and neighbors and others in this larger room here today, is that each of us is a caregiver currently and in the future. Just watching out for neighbors, caregiving our grandchildren, caregiving ourselves, and so on. You deserve and will continue to need a caregiver. So part of what I want to even ask you at this moment, won't ask you to confess or say it necessarily to even someone at your table, is who are some of your go-to people? And do you have differential caregivers in your life? If you need to offload, wail, scream, this sucks. Who are the people willing to hear you do your wailing? If you need a shoulder to cry on, who are some of the people who can be there with you for doing the tearing? If you're needing someone to go with you for a medical assessment so that you have 4 eyes and ears and persons hearing the story, who's someone who will go with you? If there are now lots of decisions that you're having to make about lots of things in your life, some of them physical and tangible and so on, and the person living with dementia was your financial whiz, or was your fix-it guy, or was your this or that, and you don't know how to do those things very well, is there someone in your circle who can aid you with some of those things? I walked out of a care facility one evening with a woman whose husband was dying of a brain tumor. I'd sat with him and her for 2 hours, had done it before, was willing to do it again. And as I walked out, I asked that question that sometimes people ask you, and I said, is there any other way I can be helpful to you? And she quickly surprised me and said, would you mind cleaning my house? I smiled a bit as some of you are laughing. Some of you are writing down your addresses. Please don't do that. I said, no one's ever asked me to do that. I have enough trouble trying to keep my own house clean, but I'm willing to entertain it. Please tell me what you're talking about. Here came the honest response. Think about, what would our loved ones say? What would you say? She turned to me and said, Ted, it's so hard to be in this place of death and dying every day and then go home to a dirty house. I just don't have the energy to clean it anymore. It was a teaching moment for me. It happened about 20 years ago. And so I cleaned her house. I cleaned her house. If you're having trouble even with those things, are you willing to let someone engage you in an intimate way and clean your house, because she knew I was going to see dust balls all around the house because she was not cleaning it. I was going to see dirty dishes in the sink and so on. She knew I would probably even open the closet doors to get to the vacuum cleaner. She didn't give a damn. She just wanted a clean house. Are you willing to move forward? I'll say more about that in just a moment. Because what I'm addressing, I won't read this one from Arthur Kleinman. He's talking about his own wife as she was moving into dementia, that caregiving is not only about emotional care, the husband-wife relationship, the partner relationship, the son-daughter, whatever it might be. It's also about, in the second paragraph, that of all the material acts that sustain the household, find practical assistance with activities of daily living, address financial aid, legal and religious tasks, and emotional support. And he goes on with all of the things that can weigh us down. It's not just the emotional care, but it's also the daily stuff that needs to be done. Here are two haunting examples of daughters facing some of their own struggles to be a caregiver of their mother. Or one is a spouse, I'm sorry. Esther Helfgott, the first one. She says, I have read in a number of places that a woman married to a man with Alzheimer's is living a widow's life. By the time I realized that I had settled into that role of being a spousal caregiver, my role had changed to include the experience of mourning, grieving, the relationship that had, for better or worse, had been something of the past. When I leave my home, grief is my escort. She doesn't think that she is no longer a spouse in the way that she thought. The kind of partnership that they had, that they would share things, that now it was on her shoulders and she was living a widow's life and so on. How is that for you? Are you able to ask for help and get some of those things done? And then here's one that's haunting at the bottom. This is a daughter. Handling mother's body violated her and me. Carrying her bedside commode from her bedroom to the toilet disgusted me. I would gag, and that would never stop. Are there aspects of caregiving that aren't your cup of tea, aren't something that you do easily? You might not even do well. And if so, how do you begin to deal with that? Can we ask for someone to do that some of the time? That is not just on your shoulders, but someone who would be more comfortable wiping a bottom, helping change diapers, doing whatever needs to be done for someone to stay safe and clean and so on. Or knowing that this is only momentary in most cases, is there a way that we can hold our nose, do it for, no, it's only going to take 5 minutes or so, do it and so that we can enjoy the rest? Or do we let that be the dominant narrative? I'm sick and tired of wiping this woman's bottom. The direction in which you look will determine what you see. Maybe she's turning in that direction too often, seeing that too much. That becomes the dominant narrative instead of seizing the other, the other hours of the day where she's not wiping bottoms but may be able to do some things that fit more with what she wants to do. Can we begin to work with people in different ways, or do we need to know it takes a team? The caregiver group that I was doing for 14 years, we would often have an elder care lawyer come in every 12 to 18 months just to offer that kind of advice and wisdom for the caregivers. And she would startle the members of the caregiver group each time she came, because it would be different people. Of course, it was a drop-in group, and different people would be there each time, because she would turn to them and say, do you know who's on your team? And then she would push them further and says, if you do not know who's on your team, you're in trouble, and your loved one is in trouble. If you can't handle the financial business, then you need to get a financial advisor. If you have trouble doing let's call it some of the blood work for someone with diabetes, or where you have to stick them with this or do this. And so that's not something good. Is there someone else who can do that? On and on and on. Who's on your team? Can you begin to let people do that? Can you even let them to move to clean your own house? That same caregiver group that I was referring to earlier, there was a woman whose husband had dementia, and he was one of those people who had trouble sitting long, being quiet. He was a mover, a shaker, if you will. And so what did she do? Because he was always needing and wanting to move, but she could not keep up with him, and she had other things that she had to do, and all of the rest, and so on. And she attended a church, and she began to corral several of his, quote, buddies at church, or at least some men who knew him, and said, I need help, and I need some people to walk with Russ. Would you be willing to walk with Russ at least once a week? And would you be willing to walk with Russ once a week? And would you be, and in a few days, she had a team of men who were willing to walk even long distances and fast with Russ, because he was a mover and a shaker. And further, it helped him and her, because he often went to sleep a little quicker. He rested a little bit more because he was doing the exercise that many of us need to do. So who's on your team? So here's one of the themes I was asked to address. It's something that I was taught now about 25 or 30 years ago, because I was quite naive. I thought there were two kinds of losses, being quite naive. There were what we would call conspicuous losses, and then there were internal losses. A conspicuous loss for me in this particular room, I say this not being able to see those of you who are virtual, but I'm looking around the room, and it appears that at least half of us in this room have a conspicuous loss. It's called sight, because we're wearing glasses. And there are other conspicuous losses, the hair loss related to cancer, someone using a mobility aid, a walker, and others, all of those things that occur. Certainly death was a conspicuous loss, because there was often a funeral or a visitation or a wake, or on and on, the various kinds of rituals that we go through. And so in the groups that I've led and still lead are often specific. So it's a caregiver group. It's a grief and bereavement group. It's a parents of children with diabetes group. It's a Parkinson's group. You can fill in the blanks. And so we would often ask people to introduce themselves in relationship to the focus of the group. So we hear the story of Parkinson's. Hello, my name is Ted, and so on, and they would share their story. And so one evening, this is about 30 years ago, we were going through that, and the group was moving around the circle and came to, let's even call it one of you, and you didn't play by the rules. I'm guessing there are some of you here in the room who don't play by the rules. And instead of saying, hello, my name is, and here's my story of dementia, here's my memory care issue, and so on, the person said, this wasn't supposed to happen. Never thought this would happen to our family. Why don't they warn you? This is not fair. This sucks. I still thought she was talking about the conspicuous loss, whatever the focus of that particular one was. I was naive. It was floating over me. And finally, another person in the group, one of you, not me, not Joe, not the earlier speakers, or the speaker here to come, and so on, someone turned to the woman and said, it sounds to me like you had some pictures of your life, pictures of the way your life was supposed to be, and life hasn't turned out to match the pictures. It sounds like you had some dreams, and those dreams are shattered. Those dreams are gone. And almost instantly, everybody in the room said, me too, over here. I thought, did I sleep through the lecture? Did I not read the text? Was I absent that day at school? And so they know more about shattered dreams than I do. And I went running out of the session at the end of the session to the library thinking I was going to find dozens of books, hundreds of articles about shattered dreams. I found very little. There's more in poetry and fiction and memoir and music, especially country music and the blues, about shattered dreams than there is in what we would call the grief and family literature. So what I began to learn, and now have become in some ways cognizant of in a deep way, or is what is on this slide of that I have no clue in this room who's had a shattered dream. Some of you were nodding your heads as if you know what I'm talking about. But it's losing an emotionally important image of oneself or one's mother. Think about Madeleine Engel. I want my mother to be my mother. She's not anymore, so on. Important image of oneself, one's mom, dad, loved one, one's family, one's life, one's work, even one's death. Many people even project the way that they want to die on the golf course or in sleep or whatever. It may or may not happen that way, losing the possibilities of what might have been. I'm guessing some of you have said that line before. What could we be doing now if, and you fill in the blank of who has dementia? What if, what if, what if, what if? Abandonment of plans for a particular future, the dying of dreams. What do I mean, even a particular future? This one could or could not include dementia. I'll leave it to you, but it's universal. A woman came up when I talked about shattered dreams and surprised me when she turned to me and said, "Ted, what should I do with the cabin?" I thought she was in the wrong room or was having a mental health crisis or something. I thought maybe there was a real estate meeting in the other room here and so on. She said, no, I'm in the right place. She said, "Ted, my man and I began talking about buying a cabin up north 20 years ago. Ted, 3 years ago, we bought a cabin. Ted, 6 months ago, he died. Ted, what should I do with the cabin?" There's the future story. That one's a bit more clear. That one's a bit more firm and so on. But think about for each of you that part of the loss of dreams may be for you not the present stuff, that maybe you are handling the present stuff fairly well, doing what needs to be done, or you have a team that's helping you to do what needs to be done. But the loss that shakes you at night or early in the morning or when you do have time to offload with someone is the loss of the future story. Related to travel, related to growing old together, relating to on and on. You can fill in the blanks and so on. There's some people in our culture who know much more about shattered dreams than some of us do. Here's a haunting piece from Langston Hughes, the great African-American poet. What happens to dreams deferred? Do they dry up like raisins in the sun, fester like sores, and then run? Do they stink like rotten meat or crust or sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe shattered dreams just sag like a heavy load. Or do they explode? Or do they explode? We've had lots of explosions because of racism in our country. What about people who are not only dealing with individual losses, the case of dementia in their family, but also are dealing with collective losses related to oppression, related to racism, related to other stories that happen in our lives? So here's some questions I would urge you as a family to discuss around shattered dreams. When you pictured this time in your life, what did you picture? That's what I mean, that we may need to take new pictures, reauthor ourselves. This is not the way we thought it was going to be. Hey, gang, let's get together here. Let's get the new script. When you thought about being a caregiver, what did you picture? Is there dissonance? Is the anger that some of you have caught up because the picture that you had of caregiving was a naive picture, not a full picture for what it's entailing and so on? How is it that what you the way that you pictured aging, how is it different or similar to the way it has turned out? Do you need to have a funeral, if you will, for that earlier picture and now embrace the new picture, the way it's going to be? If and when you thought about losses in your family, how did you think it would be? How it would happen? Who would be the one getting sick? Who would be the one leaning on and so on? Tell me about the plans that you had. So it's all of those that try to begin to get at what we might call shattered dreams. Now let me make a distinction here for you. It's not in the slides, between disappointment and shattered dreams. We all get disappointed. I hope you're not too disappointed in me as a speaker so far. We all get disappointed. You go to the vacation spot and it rains all week. You know, you can think of or what are the two seasons we have in Minnesota? Road repair and winter. Yeah, and so, yeah, all of those, we get disappointed. Oh, this is not my favorite route. Yeah. So that's disappointment. The difference between disappointment and shattered dreams has to do with the degree of investment that we have put into the pictures we put inside. And so for some members of the family, they haven't put the same investment as you had in some of the pictures, and they're not having a shattered dream about that. But you are. Because you put higher investment in those morning conversations. You've had higher investment in just being touched. Higher investment in travel. You can fill in the blanks, and that's where we may experience the shattered dreams that happen to each of us. So here are some examples of shattered dreams. In elders, the dream of retirement, the dream about how or where a home should be, the dream of time for self, because you may have your team coming in doing other things, the dream of being seen as competent. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. How many do you think you're a competent caregiver? Most of us would be a little dicey about that at times. The dream that family relationships would withstand any stress or challenge is part of your shattered dreams, that it's all on your shoulders and your brothers and sisters are not carrying their part of the load. Do you need some help from some of us to talk with your brothers and sisters and others about how they can do some of the load, even long distance? Think about my going to North Carolina a few times a year to live with my parents, which my brothers would not do. And so they were glad that I would be willing to do that so they could do something else. How do we begin to do this? The American dream of Social Security or finance. Do we have enough money for this? What about if we have to go to assisted living, to a nursing home? That's pricey. We better face that and so on. So what I've been speaking about for some time, and I want to move on to get more responses and have ample time for some Q&A with you, is a lot of ambiguity. And I said this earlier, but if you look at the part that's in red there at the bottom, polling bosses addressing the ambiguous losses, that our culture doesn't do it well because it's very stressful for a society, for a family, for a person that's accustomed to solving problems and having definitive answers. If you're one of those persons who is a list maker, a task person, who wants to do things in the proper way, you're going to have one heck of a time living with someone with dementia. Yes, there are some things that we can do that can be standard routine, that we do those things, but there are going to be other things that, as I said earlier, I wasn't sure which mother would show up some days. And so how do we begin to deal with these various things? So what I'm saying is the expectation that families can live with a chronic condition and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water without getting wet. It's going to affect the whole family. Also, we need to be aware that these happens while other stresses are going on in the family's life. You may have children and grandchildren, you may have other medical or mental health issues, all the ways that we are dealing with things in our lives. And so some responses to ambiguity. And I've said some of this in other ways, but let me say it to you more clearly now, is to label what people are experiencing. I hope I have, to help you to see that lots of this cannot be clear because that's the nature of the beast. That's the nature of the condition. But we need to provide a structure and setting for contact. This evidently is an annual event here that we're sitting in today. What are other annual or monthly or weekly where you have a structure and a setting for contact? What are some anchors of stability for you? Provide information, increase our tolerance for ambiguity. As I said, it took me 3 years, 4 years to embrace whatever mother showed up. Try to move from pushing away the ambiguity, asking questions, trying to get her to say more, to remember this, to bring photos in, to play this music, hoping that this day she would listen, and some days she did. But why was I beating up on her, beating up on myself, rather than embracing whatever mother showed up? Be flexible about routines, minimize helplessness. There's the serenity prayer, emphasize what can be changed, what cannot. and move from either or choices to both and choices. So many things. So part of what I've been saying, this is beginning just to move towards some summarization. If something is unmentionable, it's also unmanageable. Granny, do you ever want to talk about Grandpa, or do you never want to talk about Grandpa? If it's unmentionable, it also can be unmanageable. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Understanding is more important than agreement. The direction in which you look will determine what you see. Are you a person who sees problems, a kind of reactive model person? Or can you be proactive? I'll come to that in just a moment. And how things are handled is often much more important than what happens. We may not be able to have the meal together that we wanted, but at least we got the family together. As Mom was moving further into the fog, and she was in this case in a nursing home because she needed the rehabilitation because of the left side stroke, they would bring her food, and so we were wondering, where should we start? What would she want to start eating with? And we'd give her the choice. And she, I think I'll start with the dessert. That'll be okay. So she still had her wits about her. She was still wiser than the rest of us were. And so here's a big piece. I've been hinting at it, but let me just say it overtly. This is from Anna Quinlan, because I think this is the deep loss for some of us. She says, the world loves closure, loves a thing that they say be gotten through. That is why it comes as a great surprise to find that loss is forever, that 2 decades after the onset, 2 decades after the event, 3 years of living with the dementia, and then this part at the bottom is haunting to me. Something in you cries out at the continual presence of an absence. I want my mother to be my mother. And she's not anymore, not ever again. So part of what I've been doing today is to share with you stories. And I'm doing this because, like with Granny and the grandson, for some people have trouble talking about what's in here. But what we call bibliotherapy, poetry therapy, writing therapy, and so on, sometimes to use stories that are out here are more easily accessible than stories that are in here. And so if you are yourself or some of your family have trouble talking about the inner self, your own loss of dreams, to share other people's shattered dreams, that may be more accessible so that you can begin to introduce the stories of shattered dreams. Reynolds Price was dealing with spinal cancer. When I finally recovered the will to read, I searched for a book, essay, a sentence, anything that might describe what living with spinal cancer was like. Arthur Frank, a medical ethicist, says, seriously ill people are wounded not just in body but in voice. They need to become storytellers or listen to other people's stories. And so I often will draw on these kinds of tools in the work that I do. This is a poem from John Updike, Of Your Own Brand of Magic. Another regrettable thing about death is the ceasing of your own brand of magic. But some of us where someone has not died, have already lost their brand of magic. What do my brothers and I, first miss the most? Mom's cooking. Mom's cooking, that was the brand of magic, and so on. And so to have John Updike or someone else remind me that what we're missing, our shattered dream, is Mom's cooking, her own brand of magic. That's what I mean by using bibliotherapy and stories. Because throughout our lives, we are storing and restoring. So it's the reauthoring of the stories. Do you know the Judith Vore story about a little boy? My mom says I'm her sugar plum. My mom says I'm her lamb. My mom says I'm completely perfect just the way I am. My mom says I'm a wonderful, special, terrific little guy. Mom just had another baby. Why? How many firstborns do we have in the room? How many of you had a death wish for younger siblings? I mean, if you're the king or the queen, everybody's doting on you. And then something begins to show up in mother's belly or arrives by some strange word called adoption or foster care. We had a boy knock at our door. I opened the door and said, "Hey, Steve, good to see you." I said, "Would you like a baby?" I thought he was talking about a gerbil or a hamster, a cat or a dog. He said, "My mom's pregnant. We don't need another one." So there you are. Our stories change, do they not? And So we're here today talking about changing stories. So I won't linger on this one with the words on it, but let me go to this because I want to get to our time. You've been getting lots of words, both my saying them aloud as well as if you're following along with the handout. But look, if you will, at this two sets of jars. If you're willing to look at the big picture here, and those of you virtually, you've got it on your screen there. Look at the top row, and there's a big stone in the jar there to the top left. It's the dominant narrative at some point in your dementia crisis. It may be at onset when you get the official assessment. It may be 2 to 3 years later. My brothers and I never got an official assessment, but it began when there was an accumulation of losses, a loss overload, that it was the dominant narrative and so on. And so we hope with whatever actions we take, even after a conference like this, if you look at the stones in the jars, thereafter they get smaller. And it's that old adage that we say that with time, things heal, it gets better. We get used to it, we know how to do the routine and so on. But what if that's not the case? What if that's not the case? If you look at the second row of jars, the stones in the jars there are the same. Think about that as year 1 and year 3 and year 10. It's what we might call a chronic sorrow, dementia. That is not going to get better. It's a bit like ALS, it's a bit like Huntington's disease, it's a bit like some of the other conditions. Yes, it's more ebb and flow, but we know until we learn more about brain chemistry and some of the medications that are now being tried, that we're going to be living with this for the rest of this person's life. So it's a chronic sorrow, and that's year 1 and year 3 and year 10. Look what happened to the jars. It's the ability around even a chronic sorrow to embrace life as fully as possible. It's back to the Rumi. Welcome and entertain them all, but know that that's not the whole story. The chronic sorrow is part of the story, but it does not have to be the dominant narrative. Dementia does not have to be the only thing that we talk about in this family, the only thing that we live with, that we can begin to live with other things and share other stories. So what I've been trying to say over the last hour is to name the losses, to address the stressors, grieve the losses, put the loss in perspective, reinforce your support system, your team. Set limits, say no to some things so you can say yes to other things. Develop a healing plan. Go swimming at least once, maybe twice a week. Come to a session like this, let them fix lunch and all the rest. Those various kinds of tools. If we do that, we begin to promote our own resiliency as well as our family's resiliency and hardiness. It's the capacity to spring back, to rebound, to adapt to adversity, to spring forward. Ann Maston, a local, wonderful member of the University of Minnesota faculty, has written lovely things about resilience, and she says it arises from ordinary resources and processes. It's doing the daily things that help you to get through the day. The ability to connect, reconnect, and resist disconnection in response to these hardships. So be grateful for what has been, be loose with what is now, be generous with what will be. I am only one, but I am still one. I cannot do everything, but I can do some things, and because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do some things that I can do. How do you begin to divide the labors? So in March of 2022, as I was finishing up the 14 years of doing the caregiver group, I asked some of these caregivers, what do you know now that you wish you had known then? Because some of them had been in the caregiver group for 3 years, some just 3 months, different lengths of time. But what do you know now that you wish that you had known at an earlier time? Get information about caregiving from various sources, because we do things in our pattern and we may find that we can color outside the lines. We can do things differentially. Few things will stay the same. Be prepared for changes. I used to sing the old Paul Simon song, Hello Darkness, my old friend. But my verse is, hello grief, my old friend. Here you are again. Hello change, my old friend. Here we are again. And so try to practice the Rumi poem. To know that support for caregivers is crucial. You're not just caring for the care receiver. Who's caring for you? Who's on your team? When attending a group or reading, make note of takeaways. You know, the little things that you might be able to do that you hadn't thought that you could do. Ask for help, accept help. Some people are better at asking for help than they are at receiving help. If you're one of those persons, get over it. Be willing to accept help if people are offering it. That woman surprised me and said, "Would you mind cleaning my house?" Well, I've never been willing to ask someone to do that. Maybe I should. Maybe I should ask you. And so create a list of help that you can pass on. If someone says, "Is there any way I can be helpful?" Here's a list. It has differential tasks that we need done. Would you look in, if there's one or two on the list, let me know when you'd be ready. It may be to drive someone here, it may be to give someone a massage, it may be on and on. What is it that could be on the list that would be helpful to you as a caregiver? Form a team. Don't be too hard on yourself, and allow that the group members often share what seems mundane, but what should be amazingly helpful to another caregiver. There it is. So just a couple of things, and then let's move to some Q&A. You've been very patient after lunch. I'm going to ask you to, those of you in the room, to stand up and wiggle your bottom in just a moment because you've been sitting a long time. But look at this dual process model. This is something new from our Dutch colleagues, Strobe and Schutt, that seems to be resonant around the world with people of any age and deals both with bereavement as well as with grief around medical and mental health conditions like we've been talking about today. So you see the left side there of loss and stress orientation, and I've been highlighting that in some ways to help you to begin to be willing to more embrace the losses. Granny, do you want to talk about this or not? So we need times and places and venues and people with which to do the loss work. Who's there for you? With whom can you offload and be with? But we also need times and places and venues and people for restoration work, respite work, resiliency work, recovery work. So attending to life changes, doing new things, just distraction. Not today, don't want to talk about that. Not today, this is one of those private days, and so on. So save it for another time when you're ready and are able to give it your best, and even to begin to move toward what we might call new roles and relationships, the reauthoring of our lives. If we do some of that, we'll begin to move to this conundrum of what we might call reasonable hope. Reasonable is cognitive, informational. It's got some substance to it. Hope is, at some places very emotional or ethereal or loosey-goosey, or you go to the thesauruses and the book and the dictionaries, and the psychologists will say one thing about hope, and the spiritualist will say something else about it, and the philosophers will have another, and it's as if we can't agree on what hope is. But here's 5 things I would recommend before we move to a Q&A. One is that reasonable hope is relational. That's the reason I asked you to introduce yourselves to one another now an hour ago. Bob Vaninga. Those who get through a tragedy point at least to one person who stood by them, supported them, and gave them a sense of hope. Who are your hope givers? Reasonable hope is a practice, and also number 4, seeks goals and pathways to those. You don't leave it to chance. You don't leave it to good intentions. You don't hope for a better day. Rather, you begin to practice it. You put it on the calendar. You go swimming at least once a week. You do what needs to be done. We have those anchors of stability and do the things that we know that need to be done. And there's ambiguity in the middle. Reasonable hope maintains the future is open, uncertain, and influenceable. Note the last word. The future is open, uncertain. There's the uncertainty. There's the ambiguity. Which mother will show up? And influenceable. Why did it take me so long to embrace whatever mother showed up? Until we began to have new techniques and tools to be with her. And then the bottom, if you are especially down and grieving the subject of the day, reasonable hope accommodates doubt, contradictions, and despair. That's echoing back to Viktor Frankl and some of his work around the Holocaust. that even there was humanity in the midst of inhumanity. There were random acts of kindness, that even in our darkest days, there may be things that are going well. I remember talking with a woman in South Minneapolis who was too much month at the end of the money, was just having a really struggling life and so on. And I came into her house to visit one day, and there was some lovely fresh flowers sitting on the center of her kitchen. And I said, "Tell me about the flowers." She said, "Ted, I get those once a month, no matter how much they cost, because I need something of beauty in a life that has very little beauty." What is it that lifts your spirits? What is it that helps you to get through another day? Is it Mother Nature? Is it friends? Is it good food? What might it be? Take a breath. And can I ask the people in the room, those of you at home, you might even want to do it yourself, can I ask those of you in your room, if you're willing and able, would you stand up and just wiggle your bottom for a moment before we have the Q&A? And we'll announce that in just a moment. And can I ask you to begin to sit back down? Or you can begin to stand up. All right, we just need, that's what I mean by body care, that we need to do whatever so that we can focus and be with one another. Now, my understanding from my colleagues is that those of you who are with us virtually will do your questions by chat, and those will be called out to me. Those of you who have questions here in the room, if you'll raise your hand, there are going to be two people with microphones who will come around, and we'll have a good time for some questions and Q&A here.
Yes, please write your questions down on a note card, put those up in the air, and we'll grab those from you. We'll start with a couple questions from Zoom, and then we'll move to the in-person questions.
Yes, thank you so much. That was really good. I got a lot of feedback about how good that was and how moving it was, and what just an amazing presentation. So thank you. I want to preface the questions, and maybe we could have done this in the intro too, but I know this is not necessarily an easy topic to listen and hear about or talk about, and that was one of the reasons why we actually wanted to do this, because it is something that we don't get that opportunity to hear about and to discuss, and it's important. It's a part of all of our lives. We're all going to experience this, and so we thought it would be a really good topic to address here. And Ted, you're the best speaker I know on grief, and you make this topic, which is so difficult, such a warm hug, and thank you very much for being here for this. Yeah. I saw Ted present, gosh, it was probably somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago, and it stuck with me so much because it was just as beautiful of a presentation as this was. I was like, we have got to get you here because people need to hear your message. It's fantastic. Okay, so first question I have for you. I'm a 50-year-old spouse caregiver with a full-time paid job on top of the full-time caregiving job. How does one begin to figure out how to care for themselves? Coworkers mean well when they say to me, "You need to take care of you," but that isn't helpful.
Okay, if I'm understanding correctly, here's a person who is both a full-time caregiver and has a full-time job, and the question has to do with how do I alert my work colleagues of the caregiving that I'm doing?
Right. I think it's more that the colleagues know, and they're asking kind of that question that a lot of people get is like, how can we be helpful? Like we'd love to help, but they're not. She doesn't know how, or he doesn't know how to tell them how to be helpful.
Sure. Well, a couple of thoughts around that. There are multiple responses, but one is that the best of workplaces recognizes that we have our personal lives as well as our work lives. And so I would urge those of you who are workers that at least in a small team, if not with the larger team, to be willing to let people know that we've got some stuff going on at home. I'm a caregiver, and at times I might be a bit distracted. I want to be here. I want you to help me to be here, but to know that at times I may have to make phone calls, I may have to do this. And so that people, what I'm getting at there is if we don't tell our colleagues some of this, we don't need to wear the dirty or the clean linen, we don't need to go into details, but to let them know that we're going through a rough patch, then they will see our behaviors and they will jump to conclusions about what those behaviors mean. And they may carry it to a darker place, to a wrong place, because they can misinterpret those behaviors. So if they know generally that you're caregiving for someone and know just minor details, and they know that Ted seems a bit distracted that day, they can be much more forgiving about it. So that's just a general rule that I would to make. Related to that, and I'll try not to be as long as this on others. An example of what I mean is that I was asked by a company some years ago to come and meet with them because 2 employees were coming back to work, ironically, at a similar time after cancer experiences. And they said, would you help us get ready for the return of our workers? And so I began to find out something about the team and the culture. And then I asked, have you talked with either of these workers what they would like when they come back? No, that's the reason we ask you here. Tell us what to do. Kind of the fix-it, the rescue mode, and so on. And I said, I urge you to talk with each of these workers to see what they would like when they return to work. One of them had her own cancer experience, breast cancer, as I remember. The other had a child with leukemia. And they ironically were coming back to work at around the same time. They were at opposite ends of the continuum in terms of what they wanted from their team. One of them said, I live with cancer every day. It's part of my life, so I'm an open book. I'll be glad to talk about it. The other one said, there's more to me than my cancer. If I have an update, I'll let people know at the next staff meeting. So that kind of conversation I would urge also to go on. In the same way, I would urge the person who posed this question to not only work with the team, but also work with the family team. Because there may be things that he or she needs to do at home related to work that the team needs to know. Because it sounded like he was juggling both a full-time caregiver as well as a full-time job. So it's just being as transparent and as honest as we can with whatever circles we can, given the culture of the workplace and of the family. Yeah.
Yes, it sounds like so to be more direct and basically say
More
this
direct.
is what
Yep.
I need to take.
Yep.
When they say you need to take care of you, okay, this is what I need to make that happen, or
Yeah.
this is what you can help me with.
Often people are seeing things and they're wondering, what's with Ted? What's going on with him? He's not himself. Instead of our being direct with one another, then we're not doing that kind of dance that's not in the interest of anybody.
Right. Okay, another question. You had said that there are, it goes back to the help question, how there are different types of help, and I guess the question is more to like speak to what kind of help you can get from people, what the expectations might be, like how to feel comfortable asking for help. You had said, like not that, to kind of get over not being comfortable with it. And I think my experience of working with caregivers is that caregivers on a whole are people who care for other people. And so it is very hard to switch roles and then ask for or accept help because that's just not in the DNA. Do you have any kind of tips for that?
Well, I think the part that I was trying to emphasize in the talk was to be as self-aware as you can about your own skill set, about the things that you are comfortable doing and that you can do given whatever's the other stressors of your life. But there are things, as I also repeatedly said, that are not your cup of tea or that you don't do well. And what when the caregivers began to create a menu for these people who would say, is there any way I can be helpful? But to have a variety of things, but also things that you're willing to put on the list, things that don't violate your intimacy, things that don't intrude on your family schedule or whatever, but things that you really could use some help with. And You may even make it as specific, we need that on Thursday, or afternoons are better, or whatever the task might be, so that if you're giving it to someone, says, how can I be helpful? They look at the menu. It's not just give me a massage, but what kind of massage are you talking about? How often? And do we do it at your home, or do you come, the more the details, but to be as direct as you can and to create that team. So again, it's being forthright, as you were saying before, Robin, to just be direct.
Excellent. So I have another question here about stages of grief. I know all of the talk, most of the talk, was really about the grief that we experience before someone passes. This question is more about those stages of grief that we hear about after someone has passed, and just what your kind of overall thinking is on that. And I know that there has been some, it may not be as generally as linear as those stages of grief are, and just kind of what your thoughts are on that.
Well, if I'm understanding, Robin, two general things about grieving. That grieving is forever. It's not something that we, and Pauline Boss, again, would speak very firmly about this. We need to throw out the word closure. That after 3 years or 3 months or 6 months or whatever, you get over it and you get to move on. That we will be triggered, we will be ambushed the rest of our lives. There will be things that will cause us simply to begin to cry or to have a moment of grief. As Anna Quillen put it, the continual presence of an absence. Why am I crying today? Well, I missed that. Some of those will be milestones. That's the year that we were planning to do this. Those people are going over there, and I can't do that, and so on. And so that's what I mean by grieving being forever. And then the part of the question was, is there a difference between grieving while the person is still alive? And so that has to do with the daily losses, and I tried to help people look at some of the daily stresses and losses that each of us experience. And then there's the death. And I would hope, I even think about this, when Mom was dying, I was to be the speaker for our family, along with those who were officiating at the funeral. And my older brother turned to me the night before and said, if you only talk about the last years of her life, I'm going to get up and speak. He was a little bit under the influence, and I wondered what he might do it anyway, and so on. But what he wanted was there's more to the last 6 to 8 years. So it's the living life as well as that we're missing the person. And so to continue with those kinds of stories, it's also the dual process model that I was describing there at the end of the piece. I mentioned that my wife died in 2020, and there's only one piece in my latest book, but it's dealing with those both sides. I will color this time with more than a black armband, a past marker of death. There's the grieving. I will reach for brilliant, bold, bright colors and beiges, blues, and blush. I yearn for an array of colors similar to the rainbow of flowers sent so soon after her death. There's the grieving again, reminding me of the colorful life that we shared and that I can still have. So I'm talking both about living and hope and resiliency and the colorful life that we had. And what a lucky guy that I had 41 years with her. So it's that kind of thing that can focus on the living while also there are the moments of loss. And so be willing to embrace whatever shows up. Yeah.
Thank you. We do have an in-person question here. I'll turn the mic.
Hi, thanks very much. I have a husband who has temporal frontal dementia, primary progressive aphasia. It was diagnosed about 8 years ago. One of the things I just wanted to add to some of the questions is you mentioned offering a list, and I can give you some examples with my husband's friends, with my friends. I have literally asked, can you come over this evening and help me change Dell's diaper? I mean, that's how concrete I've gotten, and some people, went, kind of like, what? But I was amazed at how many people said, I'll be there, tell me what time. So I think concreteness is the thing, because I think as a caregiver, to me, there's nothing worse than somebody saying, well, what can I do? When you know darn well there is a million things that they could do. So to me, it's a conversational comment. It's not necessarily, I really want to help. One of the things I wanted to just ask too, you talk about ambiguous loss, and I think there's some reference to COVID, and I was curious as to why the reference to COVID, first of all, in this setting, because to me, I'm still married, but I've heard the term, I'm a married widow. My husband is alive, but I'm a widow. And the cycle of grief, just tying on to that, made me think, is that it's a cycle. There are some days I can go, I'm okay, this is really good, and the next day I see something different, and I am right back in the pit of where I began before. And so I just think, just to comment to people that you're going to cycle through this over and over and over again. One last thing, and I'll be quiet. The ambiguous loss for me is people not seeing me as a person who is experiencing that loss. I'm still Marilee, and my good friends know, but they don't see me as being a widow.
Yes.
And I'm not fitting in any longer with social groups that I used to fit into. And I think that is another really, really hard challenge, because you're trying to do all these things and live your life, but your whole social network has changed. So just a comment in your comments about ambiguous, that in terms of ambiguous loss when the person's still alive.
Yeah. I support much of what all of that you were saying. Even the early example of inviting some people to, on part of the list, to come over to help change the diaper, even if they weren't willing to do that, but it would help you to just have some social time afterwards, so that that's not the last thing that evening, or that's not the end of the day, that you just did the diaper one more time, that to be social, even as you said, a living widow, to have that kind of camaraderie. And so it's for each of us to decide, how do we use other people and to be direct with them. My references to COVID, yes, I'm not associating that with personal, except at the level of ambiguity, that in some ways we still are living with what's the next virus, and when is this going to happen again. And so it was really related to that some people were touched by that much more severely than some of the rest of us. They were dealing with their own cycles, but it's not the daily cycle of someone living as. Yep. I can't hear that part, so.
I was going to say the ambiguous loss. I also have a mother who's 94 years old who's going through dementia, and it's a very different sense for me, maybe because I also have a husband, who's 68 years old.
Right, yes.
To me, my loss with him is so different than losing my parent, because you kind of expect your parents to not live past their 90s. But you do expect your husband, I think a lot of us, when you get married, we're going to hit our 70s or 80s together. Totally different experiences.
Yeah. Just to reinforce what she just said there is that, remember that losses are different both in each family, but the meanings that we have of the losses. Yes, I'm missing Marge, who died in 2020 after 41 years of marriage, but her death was on time. It's different when my 23-year-old grandson died in 2017. It was off time. So it has a different kind of resonance. Both are horrible losses for me in lots of ways, but they're different, and different interpretations simply because of age or circumstances. So thank you for adding that piece. Do we have others here in the room?
There is another in-person question here. So this individual says, as a caregiver of my wonderful spouse of 52 years with early dementia, I'm a supportive and protective caregiver. She gets angry when I try to help, wanting to remain very independent and thinking that I am too protective. How does one find balance in this setting?
Oh my, that's a tough one because we're, especially with someone with differing abilities to communicate themselves, we're trying to read the cue cards, if you will, trying to figure out exactly what the meaning is. And my only two responses is one, when that occurs, take a deep breath and kind of be as self-aware as you can that I'm dealing with something here that is ambiguous. I want to do this. I want to be as helpful as I can be, but somehow we're not communicating easily with one another, and that we keep trying different methods of communicating, even the ways that we start some conversations and so on. My mom did appreciate coming in and just holding her hand when we arrived. So not starting with words, but just letting her know that we were there and physically there. And there was something about that that caused her to be somewhat more, who knows, somewhat more fully aware that we were there. As I said earlier, we wanted her, if she opened her eyes, to see a loving son sitting near her and so on. But then trying different ways to have conversations, and maybe our next speaker is going to help us some around those kinds of communications of how not to get adversarial, how not to ask too many yes and no questions, but rather to be as playful as we can with someone. There's a new book out by Ann Basting called Caring Conversations, and I see someone shaking head about it, but she's a gerontologist by chance, and describes her first awareness that her mom might be moving toward dementia very early as an older woman. They were washing dishes together for perhaps the 100th time, the 200th time that daughter and mother had washed dishes together, and Anne was doing the dishes and her mom was doing the drying. And all of a sudden, in the midst of this normal day, think about what I was saying about typical days and assumptive days, her mom held out a bowl and said, "Now where does this bowl go?" And it was one of those flash points for Ann Basting that, oh my gosh, she knew enough that might be a sign of something that might be related. But instead of saying, "Mom, you know where it goes. Mom, we've done this 100 times. Mom," rather what she did as a caring conversation and a playful conversation was, "Hey, well, let's look around. I bet we can find a good place for it." And then began to open the doors, cabinets here or there. I wonder if this bowl would go up in this section. And to be playful instead of adversarial, instead of yes and no, instead of right and wrong, instead of the typical way. And that's one of the losses for us. We can't have those back and forth conversations, but trying to meet the person where they are, not where we want them to be. And in this case, let's look around. I bet we can find a home for this bowl. Yeah, let's keep it in our family. And the same way to do that kind of playful conversation. So that would be one of the kinds of responses for, it's easier said than done, but the more that we can simply play with one another. I remember, who was it, one of the New York Times editors years ago said, children are very seldom solemn when they play. They're almost always serious when they play. So we can be serious, we're dealing with serious things, but we can do it in a playful way. Engage with the person. Yeah. Other questions, or do we need to move to the break?
I think it's time for the break. Any other questions we'll answer offline.
I'll be glad to
but
linger
yes,
for a bit if you
we'll get
want.
the information.
And you have my email, as I said. I'll be glad to continue conversations with
Perfect.
you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.